All right, and we are back with finally the last piece of Achille Mbembe's Necropolitics. It's been a few weeks, I believe every second week. But next week, I promise, I will start the John David Ebert review of Art After Metaphysics. I know that this week's been kind of a slog. This this particular text. But you asked for it, ladies and gentlemen. So the final spicier part is right in the middle with his chapter on Fanon, which I'm going to have to paywall because it gets into some quite some spicy territory. But what I'm going to read is the final two shorter chapters that deal with a lot of his more reflective theoretical work. And I feel like these chapters are pretty good. He talks about the anti-museum. He talks a little bit about Afrofuturism. Very interesting. So the first one is called The Stifling Noonday. And the second one, the conclusion, is called The Ethics of the Passerby. So I'm sure it will, he talks about a lot of different historical references, but hopefully we can get past that. So yeah, let's do the shilling. Let's get it out of the way. So, of course, like, share, and subscribe. Every week, Giantart Reviews brings you interesting texts. I think maybe I will do a few articles next week before I get to John David Ebert. There's an art article I want to do, and there's this Byung-Chul Han article that I want to do that talks about the work of art. So, like, share, and subscribe. Please subscribe to patreon.com/GiantarProductions. And of course, my Substack, Geo's Content Corner, where every audio is also available in case you don't want to pay for the Patreon version for whatever reason. I like Substack. I'm very pro Substack. It's a really good platform. If God forbid something happens to, YouTube or whatever, I think I could be all right just with, those platforms. But the free version on Substack, which is one feature I really do like, as opposed to Patreon, which is they let you have the preview, which is where I put the free version for all the, all of my subscribers. Even if you're not paid for it, please subscribe to my Substack. I want to get those numbers up. So they give you a free version, then they also get you the paywall version. So, very good. But anyways, moving on. This is The Stifling Noonday. I love that title, by the way. When Fanon died, his eyes were fixed on Africa, or precisely on what he called the Africa to come. Remember, there is always a sort of latent Afrofuturism that was inspired by the works of Fanon, after the sort of cleansing, if you will, of the colonial order, to say no more. Born in Martinique, passing through France, he tied his fate to Algeria's very own. Through Algeria, he had at last accomplished, as from the rear, the tour of the triangle. To participate in the ordered movement of a continent, he maintained, that was ultimately the work I had chosen. The Africa he discovered in the aftermath of decolonization is a maze of contradictions. The Congo is at a standstill. The great colonialist citadels of South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, Rhodesia, Southern Africa, are still in place. The specter of the West hovers everywhere. New national bourgeoisies are already in the path of predation. Funny how one power vacuum in the colonial, the post-colonial moment fills up another one, right? So, funny how that works out. As if one listens with, quote, with one ear glued to the red earth, one very distinctly hears the sound of rusty chains, groans of distress, and the bruised flesh so constantly present in the stifling noonday. And I believe that was also a quote in, was it Psalms? About the pestilence that walketh in darkness, the terror that arrives at noonday. I believe that was also, might have been an unconscious reference Fanon had. Such is nevertheless the project. The new world is inseparable from the advent of a new human. Difficult work. Fortunately, in every corner, arms make signs use to us. Voices answer us. Hands grasp ours. Having essentially begun in the mid-18th century, modern Africa and the diasporic reflection on the possibility of a new world took place largely as part of the humanist thinking that has prevailed in the West over the past 3 centuries. So again, it's really a lot of these more European, let's face it. I mean, it is true there is, like, as much as there is unique, African ways of thinking, Fanon very much was a product of this European intellectual tradition, right? I mean, being educated in France, being educated by Sartre and so forth, Marxism, you name it. Like, there is, in a sense, and I think even from a reactionary perspective, you could say that what this sort of quote-unquote new humanity that can be looked at positively and negatively, depending on what political persuasion you're from, really was the product, I think, of Faustian Man. I think that it wasn't wholly a product of Faustian Man. It was sort of, depending on your reaction to it, depending on perspective. For example, if you were on the political right, you say that this new population of the earth, this repopulating of the earth, is inherently this, like, weird, in itself reactionary vengeance against European peoples for colonialism. I mean, the whole bit, right? I mean, that's, So, in a way, you can say that, depending on your persuasion, you could say that this sort of new humanity was, in some ways, the negative side of that same Faustian spirit. Remember this. It's not like a lot of the sort of talk of Faustian Man is really, I think, neglected. Like, the negative aspects of it are neglected. I mean, this is what Spangler said, is that really it's a bargain. Really, it's something that could even drive Faustian spirit into the dust through its own need to conquer and explore and go beyond the limitations of itself. That this also produces civilizations on its out, rather than, it just as much produces the winter as it produces the spring. There's sort of an overreach there. And I think a lot of the problem is that when you're caught up with the aesthetics of a lot of, like, current E-right thinking, then you can, you say that Faustian spirit's like an automatic positive thing. But anyways, we could see that, a lot of these quote-unquote humanist values that the right wing, really doesn't like, we can easily see that, well, actually the origins of it are something that goes beyond, it's something within the value structure of a lot of European, uniquely European ways of thinking. It's something that we would choose to ignore. We like to think that there's something outside. But of course, if you're on the political left, as Mbembe is, then you would say that, automatically it's no shaming to use the tools of a population that has, sort of subjugated the rest of the world, right? So, but anyways, moving on. And I think Fanon also mentioned this in his writings as well. So the number of autobiographies figure among the very first Afro-American writings is, from this viewpoint, revealing. It's not saying I am the first of all spoken words by which humans speak to make themselves exist as such. Also significant is the place that religious narratives occupy in the narration and interpretation of their history. In conditions of terror, impoverishment, and social death brought on by slavery, the community that has been debased and struck with the mark of a stain, having recourse to theological discourse to pronounce oneself and state one's past, must be understood as an attempt to reclaim a moral identity. So, ever since, via successive junctions, this reflection has continued to examine the conditions from forming a properly human world in which the subject would be given on the basis of an ideal from which life would be drawn its resilience. So again, it's understandable. I know a lot of Marxists, they say that when Marx called religion the opium of the masses, he really meant that was a lament, that was like, that was a sign of their subjugation, and that wasn't like an automatic fedora tip cynical commentary. But then again, you look at my modern Marxists, right? Well, that's debatable. But anyways, it's the same point. It's like a lot of religious traditions came about from conditions of subjugation for an obvious reason. There's always going to be that urge for a metaphysical essence in the wake of total dehumanization. So, but of course, Fanon, he historically downplayed the role of religion. So this is subtitle, Deadlocks of Humanism. This effort of self-examination and self-comprehension would bring out two things. First, it is not useless to recall this, that the history of African Americans, or let's call it Africans, he uses a gamer word, but, is not a separate, not the gamer word, the horror, but, I'm not comfortable saying it for YouTube. It is integral part of history of the world. Africans are legatee of this history of the world in the same way as the rest of human genus is. In addition to retracting the chains of their distinct origins and their distant origins, almost inevitably leads back to Africa. Their sojourn in the world has, by contrast, unfolded by the way of displacement, circulation, and dispersion. As movement and mobility have been structuring factors in the historical experience, today they find themselves spread across the face of the earth. And so there is no past of the world, or any region of it, that must not take into account the past of Africans. Just as there is no African past that ought not to be informed the history of the world as a whole. Well, yeah, I mean, that's... But then I think he's going to sort of critique this humanism that sort of, doesn't really... It doesn't, there's the sort of liberal, celebrate diversity, celebrate everyone's identity. That really doesn't amount to anything. It really just is a homogenization of the world with a few identity markers thrown in, but, we'll see what he says. So, thus, Africans constitute part of the West. Even the present and the self-awareness of the West often crops up only in the mode of obsessive fear, denigration, and effacement. In this relation, James Baldwin maintains that concerning America, the Africans are integral to the history of the New World, where they have contributed to shaping and accompanying all this. So yeah, let me skip, because you know all this. Then he talks about Paul Gilroy again, but let me get to his point, really. African slaves, modernity's real dredge, together with a multitude of other anonymous individuals, were at the heart of the quest of the quasi-cosmic forces released by European colonial expansion at the dawn of the 17th century and by the industrialization of Atlantic metropolises at the beginning of the 19th century. If their inscription in the modern course of human history is carried out onto the veil of anonymity and effacement, it nevertheless conserves the triple dimension, planetary, heteroclide, and polyglot, that will deeply stamp their cultural productions. So this sort of diffusion of people is like the diffusion of any sort of biological process. There's mitochondria, there's sort of multiplication, there's, cross gene speciation, these, Mbembe is using a lot of these metaphors that, that comes from Deleuze, for instance, and Guattari, that sort of using biological metaphors to describe the same processes on a more intangible social and geo-historical level. So, if the planetary dimension of the African fact is more or less acknowledged, the African question, he's using a particular word, but, as posed in the frame and term of Western humanist thinking, constitutes to be subject to critiques, some internal, others external. Indeed, from the vantage point of the continental African and African American history, Western humanism, racial slavery, racial capitalism, and the cauldrons in which the idea of black difference, of blackness, was produced. To be sure, capitalism must be understood as economic system, but it is not an apparatus of capture. It's also an apparatus of capture and a regime of science. A certain kind of compulsion, that is, a certain mode of organization and redistribution of power. So again, very much it's the mercantile class. Very much it's the regime of science in that value is given and predicated on a certain basis in the capitalist system as opposed to other systems. So a lot of leftist academics, when they talk about capitalism, they're talking about a very expansive definition of it. They're talking about this particular regime of signs, how it transforms human relations itself. I mean, all this comes from Marxism, and then critical theory later took in a different direction. That's another thing. A lot of this critical theory isn't exactly inherently Marxist, although Mbembe himself, I believe, has a few Marxist sympathies, of course. But so then he says there's a certain mode of organization, redistribution of power, is compulsion to categorize, to separate, to measure, to name. So again, this is enframing. This is the logic of enframing. This is the regime of science that capitalism has produced. Of course, Mbembe, and then, even before him, Fanon, would say that this is, and a lot of, critical black studies would say that this is because capitalism is racialized. In other words, so, you gotta realize that, yeah, we snicker at it when we see it on the timeline. But a lot of these academics do have a point when they say that they're trying to create this sort of connection between the modes of production in capitalism and certain, the racialization of it through the predominantly European economic system or Eurocentric economic system that isn't the same way that a lot of these other, global South populations do things, right? So, I mean, this is obvious, but then, of course, when you bring it home, in the American, woke example in particular, it becomes, particularly egregious. But the point being is that they have a precise way of saying things. They're not just quote-unquote making it up in a way. There's a sort of logic to it that I think should be addressed. If you're in the political right and you want to effectively argue with them, or if you want to effectively sort of know the tricks of the trade. I mean, and it's true, there is a faction of the political right that also looks at this type of system. I noticed that there is, I'm getting distracted here. But from a right-wing perspective, I noticed that there's a war going on between people who are, more sympathetic to socialist ideas and people that are no, actually, capitalism, it's true what the leftists say about it. It's it's uniquely European, and we foisted it upon the world. And, a lot of this our acceleration, Nick Land stuff, it's funny, I saw this viral tweet the other day. It was some Instagram, no, it was it's on Twitter. It was one of those women that hover around irony cell accounts that said, "I can't believe I'll never live in a world without capitalism. You'll always live under capitalism." And then my friend Julius posted a picture of Nick Land saying, "Yes, for all of eternity, this is the mode of relation and production that will dominate the earth and actually supersede the earth." So, but the thing is, Mbembe, he's red land. He just doesn't cite land, but he's probably red land. Obviously, I've said before. So, there, this type of critical theory is saying, yes, actually, Western humanism is tied to capitalism, is tied to the neoliberal economic system, which is also tied to this underbelly of, racialization and so forth. And in a way, it's the academic arrives at what Nick Land called super racism, with global meritocracy and the IQ shredder, but from a more critical perspective. It's very funny how that works out. So, whenever an order is manufactured or value is extracted, that which is deemed valueless is made redundant. So a lot of things, even for example, the work of art, people capitalist money mind, that sort of supreme homo economicus mindset is saying that, actually the only things that produce utilitarian worth are valuable. So that's that's what just gives substance to a signifier and to wear a mask. This does not simply apply to objects, it applies to people as well. Again, this is straight up from Heidegger. This is what ordering is all about under slavery, colonialism, and capitalism. It is about the separating of what is useful from waste, from detrituses. So again, he's saying that the colonial system leads into the modern capitalist system. So if you follow the logic of a lot of the political left, the contemporary political left, they would say that there's no difference. Actually, the colonial system, the penal colony, has extended to the workplace, extended to social relations under the capitalist system. But of course, when they say, how do you break out of that? That's when they get into, woo territory. But as a result, any critique of humanism in the context of black life must take at this point of departure not so much what some have called social death as the matter of waste, or how to retrieve the human from history of waste. So again, populations being rendered into waste, into death. or to part differently, a history of desiccation, of ripping apart, of deracination. Furthermore, African and African American history is not so much about social death as is about the permanent generation, recreation, and resignification of life flows in the face of the force of capture, extraction, and desiccation. So again, this is very much Fanon's attempt to say that there must be a creation of the new. And this what leads into the point about Afrofuturism that Mbembe will get into, right? So, although we could say that, I mean, let's be aware of the real political situation. I mean, it's funny how these affirmations of, like, black identity or any sort of, like, BIPOC or whatever, LGBT, whatever identity, all these things, they still are in this process of capture. They're parroted by the current reigning economic system, right? It's not really a threat to it. But, you know, I don't know. I mean, Mbembe alludes to woke capital, but he never quite gets there. So at different times and under various circumstances, the ropes are drawn together, ribs are shattered, victims are mercilessly... oh, God, I don't think I could say that word on YouTube. An act of, you know, Sodom and Gomorrah, right? I can't say it, but in the process, various organs are sucked dry. So then he goes on this elaborate sort of, like, poetic excess, but we could skip it. Underlying this process has been a question of unreason and unfreedom. For those who, for centuries, were condemned to live their lives in a cage or in a monstrous hood, humanism often took the face of an inhuman head in the form of wolves' jaws, a machine geared towards the elimination of certain classes of human beings located at the interface of the human and the non-human. So humanism as desiccating what is non-human, this is more of a classic understanding of humanism, but then this system would also extend to nowadays, right? So this is this whole point. So, elimination of certain classes of humans being located at the interface of the human and the non-human. The human, the commodity, the object, the thing, the black as a thing, the burning fossil, the fuel, the capitalism during its primitive era. But this is not all. In practice, the critique of Western humanism also took the form of attempts to resemble some form of social or community, and as such, the form of attending to matter of cares and matter of repair. Flight itself has no other function except to create conditions under which to attend to the permanent labor of repairing that which has been broken. Whatever African slaves happen to be settled wherever, the work of producing symbols and rituals, language, memory, and meaning, and therefore the substance necessary to sustain life never stopped. Nor did the interminable labor of caring for and repairing that which has been broken. The Sisyphean-like effort to resist being turned into waste, partly explains with like plantation slavery, differs from other forms of G-word idle colonialism. Then he talks about in America, personhood's crucial. Then let's move on to, oh, here you go. This is an important point before he gets to the second subheading called the other as human. So he says that whatever, so Delizigatari, since many objectively couldn't flee or escape, it becomes a matter of knowing when and how to cross over to become somebody else. Self-separation, imperceptibility, is the face of what Delizigatari called an overcoding machine. Obviously, there was all kinds of risks attached to the dizzying state of endless crossing and becoming, whose end was simply to stay away. So this comes from the faciality chapter, where the face is overcoded as a majoritarian or minoritarian. The face has certain features that distinguish power or affluence or subjugation. They didn't exactly mean it like in like the way that like woke academics meant it. It was in some ways a metaphysical exercise, but you know, even though Delizigatari is like quite anti-metaphysical. Whether with Césaire or with Fanon, the internal critique tends to emphasize the death drive and the desire to destroy at the very core of the Western humanist project. Notably that the project is shut within the convolutions of colonialist and racist passion. In the general fashion, whether with Césaire Fanon or with Senghor or Glissant, the question of repudiation of the idea of man as such once and for all never arises. More often the concern is the point of the deadlocks of Western discourse on man with the aim of amending it. This point then amounts to either to insisting in the face of the human is less named than a praxis and becoming winter, or else to appeal to a new, more planetary humanity, Gilroy. to a poetics of the earth, and to a world made of the flesh of all, glissant, which these are various thinkers, which each human subject could once more be the bearer of his speech, his last name, his acts, his desires. So then moving on from this sub-chapter, the voice must shift because it must confront something not so much unique as soiled, wasted lives it must attempt to retrieve from a broken existence. It must provide them with a home or a place where they might be at peace. So the critique of Western humanism is akin to returning to life of the harvest of bones that has been subjected to the force of desiccation in an attempt to render the world habitable again and for all. And for the external critique, it comes in this three versions. The first, Afrocentric, set out to demystifying the universalist pretensions of Western humanism and lay a foundation for knowledge endowed with categories and concepts drawn from the history of Africa. On this view, the notion of humanism essentially reduces the structure that faces historical depth and African originality. Humanism's function, it is argued, lies in the arrogant power of self-recounting and of defining in the place of others where those seem others come from, and that they are where they must go. Humanism is thus a myth that does not want to say its name. So whence, for example, in Chayat an Diop, the will to counter European mythologies with others held to be more vertical and more apt to open out different geologies of the world. But if Afrocentrism formulates the question of humanism based on the possible debt of civilization and the world would owe to Africa, this line of thought nevertheless advocates no less than what Diop calls the general progressive humanity, the triumph of the notion of the human species, the human race, and the hatching of an era of universal understanding. So then he talks about Afro-pessimism, Afrofuturism later on, but which is quite interesting, actually. I was hoping he would get to Afro-pessimism and Afrofuturism. And the anti-museum is also a very interesting concept. But I guess to finish off that subcategory would be that, the critique of humanism is quite interesting because it both arrives both the critical theorist and the racist reactionary chud. They both have that same notion of, this notion of post-enlightenment humanism that demarcates a universal value upon every living thing on earth, a human being, actually has a whole history of leaving peoples out, that it sort of flattens difference. And so a lot of academics would say that actually humanism is not this progressive Whig history linear force, but actually had to mutilate and desiccate different forms of humanity completely. So even in the critique of mysticism that comes out of the Enlightenment, that is basically sectioning off how most of the world's peoples think, right? So, but then the problem is when you acknowledge difference, then they would say, well, actually the racist right-wingers, they will also acknowledge difference. So woke academics are sort of in this discursive loop that goes nowhere. That's the problem. Because they have to admit racial difference, but they can't. Because then the chuds would get at it, right? So, but that's besides the point. The point being is that, Fanon and Mbembe are both saying that this universalist Western humanism is actually a history of violence. That's the main point, right? It's not this progressive liberal thing, but it had to purposefully delineate the human and non-human in such a way that can predicate universal value on what mostly European Enlightenment thinkers thought the human was. So anyways, moving on. So now we have the subheading, the other of the human, where he gets into Afro-pessimism and Afrofuturism. The second and third objections, the ones on which we shall focus our attention here, stem from the so-called Afro-pessimist and Afrofuturist trends. Racial pessimism is, to a large extent, a product and outcome and a key affect of liberalism. Liberalism has historically generated various forms of racial anger, rage, or frustrations. It's almost as if multiculturalism has an effect on that. Funny how that works. In turn, in a certain instances, pessimism has been taken up as a self-understanding. In Democracy in America, Volume 2, Alexander de Tocqueville examines race relations in the context of American democracy. He ends up concluding that an American democracy that accommodated blacks in particular is an impossibility. He then argues for one form or another reparation of the Africans back to Africa. Go on and go on. In fact, liberal democracy and racism are fully compatible. At the same time, I'm sure the liberals wouldn't want to hear that, right? I mean, that's... In fact, at the same time, historically, liberal democracy has always needed a constitutive other for its legitimation. An other who is and is not at the same time part of the polis. We recognize pessimism whenever the language of impossibility and reparation and repatriation saturates speeches or becomes the final word in any utterance. While Tocqueville pessimism is articulated in the language of indivisibility and the impossibility of sharing. From a Tocquevillian perspective, the freedom of the white race, and of course he puts white race in brackets, shocker, is both absolute and indivisible. It cannot be shared with any non-white entity. If necessary, it will be secured by redacting and other organizations. In this case, racial pessimism is anchored to white America's deep belief and convictions that the freedom and security of the white race can be guaranteed only at the expense of the life of non-whites, so on and so forth. Racial pessimism is based on the belief that for white America to exist at all, it must continually produce a complex of bodies and chains, and he uses the gamer word there, are not only... So the gamer words are not only the conditions of possibility of America. There are a class of people America cannot live without, people America doesn't want to share anything with, although without them America means nothing, or not much. America in this sense means the impossibility of sharing freedom with others, which whiteness probably understood is embedded in Tocqueville's vibrant apology of liberal democracy, is therefore virulent racial pathos. Contemporary liberal democracies have not departed from this constituted pessimism. Well, I mean, they certainly try. I mean, I don't know, that's kind of, yeah, it's... I shouldn't say anything more, but I think we'll have to agree to disagree with his assessment of contemporary liberal democracy and how, like, the notion that, like, contemporary liberal democracy empowers European populations is kind of ridiculous, but, you know, whatever. We'll move on. Racial circumscribed bodies built on a politics that disavows passages, bridges, conjunctions of intensities. But see, again, this is sort of the paradox here, because he's chastising liberalism, but is his post-liberalism that much different than the contemporary liberals now? Like, I don't understand this whole... I'm frustrated because I don't understand this whole theory selling again about, you know, passages and connection, the repopulation of the earth. How is this any different from Justin Trudeau's worldview? I don't understand. It's a more, like, word cell version of it. At the end of the day, it's not entirely radical in the sense of, like, if you're admitting on one end that these hostilities are ever present and they've always been there throughout history, there's only a few options. Either you wholeheartedly believe in sort of a, I don't know, global oneness, or you know that it's not going to work in various, you know, Western civilization countries, and you're just doing it, well, maybe they know it doesn't work, but the reason, the sort of benefits of, you know, mass social animus between populations and groups, I wonder if the ruling class sort of really does believe in diversity as their strength. I wonder what reason there is. But anyways, the idea of racial categorical antagonism, moving on. So the concept is indeed a Trojan horse, liberalism that has trapped the African in a permanent state of death, social or otherwise. As a matter of fact, there is a mimetic relationship between two forms of asymmetrical racism, a hegemonic racism and a subaltern racism, both which speak to the same language but with different accents. They do not operate the same plane and do not wield the same amount of power, but they do share the same fantasy of a freedom that is a freedom only of oneself, indivisible and absolute in the face of an absolute outside. See, though, that's the problem, though, is that liberalism purported that it didn't need an outside. It didn't need an antagonistic relationship to another group. That really the whole world will be liberal. Like, this was the end of the Soviet Union, you know, the whole world will be like us. We won. Well, quote-unquote we, quote-unquote won, quote-unquote who. You know what I mean? Like, it's the fantasy. So the sort of, like, post-racial, multicultural liberalism obviously is a failure in that sense. Because it still maintains an other, Only Mbembe thinks it's like, the classic minorities, African Americans, but, well, we all know the truth of like what group, uh, we all know what group is sort of slated for targeting that has become socially acceptable. In fact, it's a form of normie sadism to go after in terms of, you know, but, we'll say no more, do not wield the same amount of power. They do not operate in the same plane. The kind of metapolitics, privilege, shock, and destruction is called for the burning of memories. The belief that what we might emerge from the ashes can never be worse than what we already endured. So Afrofuturism is a literary, aesthetic, and cultural movement. I guess he means like liberalism, saying like, burn your past and all will be well. Afrofuturism is a literary, aesthetic, and cultural movement that emerged among the diaspora during the second half of the 20th century. It combines, well, I guess 21st century as well. It combines science fiction, magical realism, with black culture and non-European cosmologies, with the aim of interrogating the past of so-called, well, he uses a word, but I'm going to say POC, people of color, peoples and their conditions in the present. Afrofuturism rejects outright the humanist postulate insofar. Well, I read a bit of Afrofuturism, and yeah, it's trying to essentially create in some ways like a more, I wouldn't say post-liberal because that term has been thoroughly polluted by the people, the various peoples, but let's call it not an illiberal, but rather a non-liberal form of human worth. Rejects outright the humanist postulate insofar as humanism can constitute itself only by relegating some other subject or entity to the mechanism and status of an object or an accident. Well, that's kind of impossible. I mean, if you look at human history, that's kind of like, well, we can debate over that, but I think like one point would be that like the thing about like anti-humanism comes in a variety of ways. A lot of these like critical theory, like critical race studies people, they mean like, anti-humanism or post-humanism as an affirmative in the sense of the way that, for example, Foucault and others have deconstructed the term. You know what I mean? Like, to them, humanism is a very specific set of ideological presuppositions that come out of the European Enlightenment and universalizes a very particular experience. So that's their critique of it. That doing so, the African bears with him the human's tombstone. He is a phantom haunted by Western humanist delirium. Western humanism thus stands as a sort of vault haunted by the phantom of one that has been forced to share the destiny of the object. Armed with the rereading, the Afrofuturist currently declares that the category of humanism is now obsolete. The aim is to adequately name contemporary conditions. Its spokespersons suggest it will be necessary to do so based on all of the assemblage of objects, humans and of human objects, of which, since the advent of modern times, the African is a prototype or prefiguration. For ever since the interruption of Africans, again, he's saying a particular word I can't say, is the prototype of modern world, no human exists that does not immediately participate in the non-human, or more than human, or beyond human. So again, he's saying that, like we participate with non-human animals and other various, non-human objects, he's saying because historically the African has been labeled less than human, but yet he's buying into the African origins theory of human evolution. He's saying that we're all like marked by the expansion of, what has historically been a subjugated class of people. In other terms, the human could be talked about only in the future tense and always coupled with the object, henceforth the human double, or even its sarcophagus. The African is the future's prefiguration. As history of the African refers to the idea of quasi-infinite potentiality of transformation and plasticity, borrowing from fantasy literature, science fiction, technology, music, and performing arts, Afrofuturism attempts to rewrite the African experience of the world in terms of more or less continuous metamorphoses of multiple inversions of plasticity, including anatomical and of corporeality, if required, machinic. On its own, the Earth could be the sole place of habitation of this form. Could not be the sole place of habitation. So yeah, there's a lot of science fiction within Afrofuturism as well. The Earth is historical configuration who's essentially become a vast prison for the metal man, the silver man, the wood man, the liquid man, the body of extraction destined for endless transfiguration. A vessel both metaphorical and plastic, his dwelling could only be the whole wide universe. The Earth condition is thus replaced by the cosmic condition. I believe he's referring to like even musicians like Sun Ra. The Afrofuturist repudiation, the idea of man stemming from modernity, may seem surprising. Does this repudiation not ultimately reinforce the traditions of thought that prospered by flagrantly denying African humanity? This would be to forget that since the advent of modern times, we have inhabited the dream of becoming masters and possessors of ourselves in nature, which is the classic Enlightenment project. To achieve this, as necessary for us to come to know ourselves, nature, and the world. The idea we inhabited from the late 17th century was the condition of really knowing ourselves. Nature and the world would require the integration of all fields of knowledge, using algebra to modern nature and life. A modality of knowledge thus gradually imposed itself and consisted essentially in flattening out the world, that is to say, homogenizing the entirety of the living, rendering it objects interchangeable, multipliable at will. So that's like the Enlightenment, instrumental reason right there. Is a movement to varying degrees and with incalculable consequences that accompany that other historical process typical of modern times, namely the constitution of world spaces under the aegis of capitalism. So capitalism, of course, feeds into this instrumental reason in the Western Hemisphere, the Atlantic, blah, blah, blah. The solar and the glowing red figure of the worker, by extension, the proletariat. We are only just starting to understand the ecological metabolism, matter, energy involved in those manhunts. Two emblematic figures marked with this new historical cycle. First, the shadowy figure of the African slave. The second is the proletariat, so a little bit of Marxism here. The Atlantic depended closely on the system, combining raids, wars of capture, and diverse forms of manhunt. The ecological disturbances brought about by the vast draining of humans and its process of violence has yet to be systematically studied. So yeah, he touches upon environmental racism. But let me read off the chapter before I get to explain what he's trying to say here, or at least my understanding of it from what little I've read of Afrofuturism. Enormous capital manifestly had... But by the way, there are some thinkers that think that Afrofuturism is possible, by the way. Afro-pessimists, for example, think that it's literally just science fiction fantasy and that it's like woo-woo mysticism to say that all of the social conditions against, Africans around the world, that somehow that's going to be ameliorated by this like futuristic type of thinking. In the Atlantic economy, numberless paradoxes nevertheless characterize the world of slaves. On the one hand, while useful for harvesting profits, these slaves are subject to the deep symbolic and social devaluation through their abasement. So again, they become instruments of economism. They become traded. They become inframed, literally inframed human beings. They spoke, sang, and prayed. Of course, there's a lot of different modes of resistance and the work of art and prayer and in fighting techniques and so forth that slaves developed. They expressed lack of pain and sadness. They revolted when they were at the end of their tether. The uprising of slaves, motif of absolute terror for the masters. So then he's verging into, let's call it Haitian romanticism. In addition, although deeply sullied and stigmatized, these fundamental human beings constitute a reverse of value. The reverses of values in the eyes of their owners, the same way as money or, again, commodities. They serve as a medium for all sorts of economic and social transactions. This living flesh has an economic value that can be suited to the occasion, measured and quantified. A price can be attached to it. The matter produces from the brow, sweat of slaves, has also been an active value insofar as the slave transforms nature, converts energy into matter, is himself at once a material and an energy-giving figure. Like most other things, like machines themselves, they transfer value and energy and so forth. So, but he sort of leaves off, he's sort of very kind of like disjointed here when it comes to Afrofuturism. I don't see where he's getting at, It's kind of, he doesn't square the circle, I feel, in terms of like connecting those two. But let me try to make sense of this. So, given the writing of Sun Ra, the writings of Sun Ra, the jazz musician who was also like the sort of proto-Afrofuturist, who came up with this sort of mystical theory that he was from Saturn, and that essentially that the sort of African populations of the Earth, they have to find their place in the stars. And it very much was about. I have this great book that's on it, on him. And it's very much like the idea of this world is oppressive and bleak, and therefore we must find another one, or we must create another one, or the other world is present elsewhere. And this has been sort of like a theme in Afrofuturism, especially the literature side of it, which is that there's sort of a doubling of the world, one in which we are beings. I guess you could say that, I mean, in the Western tradition, you would almost call it Gnosticism, where there's sort of, or a form of it, where there's this sort of, I don't know, will Tinkzorg write his follow-up article on Afrofuturism, being Gnostic, right? No, where essentially that, you are a being of spirit or light, and the sort of material conditions are that which is weighted with the wounds and the lesions of oppression and slavery and colonialism, and there's this idea that runs through it, right, of this sort of doubling of the world. So in a way, also, another interesting element is that it takes sort of a future-orientated look, but it's not like an extension of the humanist project into space. It's not like transhumanism. It's almost, I mean, it has elements of transhumanism, but it's more of like, okay, we reject the Enlightenment European notions of humanism, and therefore we build from this weird, it's almost like archaeofuturism in some ways. It's like archaeofuturism for BIPOC people, in the sense of like, it says that, the human is something that, in the experience of subaltern populations, is something that had to adapt. Illegality, refugee status, being banned, being subjugated to indentured servitude. So therefore, the picture of the human is not as solid as it is to Europeans. What Mbembe is saying, which is an interesting idea, that from the populations of the global south have been subject to these, unique pressures and conditions, that they have always been accustomed to basically their humanity being extrapolated or rendered into like economic use value, or essentially being banished from nation state and personhood and economic and political and even cultural status, which Fanon goes into, which I'll get into the paywalled version, about the cultural erasure of these colonial peoples. And so therefore the sort of solid and stalwart picture of the human within like liberal European humanism doesn't really give you an accurate picture. But Afrofuturism is particularly interesting because it takes the traditions of the past in these various like global diaspora, global South populations, these various, and as a way for the diaspora to connect to their traditions, but to realize that they're really cut off from its original place within Africa and within other places in the global South, that you must rebuild these traditions from a futuristic lens, that you must, in a way, take on their aesthetics and their spiritual meaning within the context of very forward-looking futurist artwork. So there was this one, I think it was a music series that was accompanied by a book where it was about sort of the slave ships that sunk, and these Africans become amphibious beings. There was one like that, and they sort of have their own like way of. It's basically like it was like the Afrofuturist version of Atlantis. I remember my one professor, he got us to read this stuff, in political science. But no, it's a very interesting idea, especially Sun Ra being a jazz musician, being someone who like was an outsider artist, and combining outsider art combined with ideas about socio-political and cultural foundations towards a greater Afro identity, which I think is quite positive. I think it's way better than what the wokes, have produced, which is essentially just re-engineering liberalism in the favor of like, this coalition of the BIPOC, LGBT plus CIA type of, coalition. I think that Afrofuturism is much better. There was this outsider artist in Harlem who was a trash collector who would like use these very interesting assemblages of altars and his own like Afro spiritual like religion that took elements of Christianity, took elements of various African traditions, and took like a lot of different sort of new age type of stuff. Let me look it up for you. Yeah, Hampton Thorne. I always forget his name, but he created these altars. He was I believe he was a trash collector. And he created these very elaborate, incredible altars, and he had his own accompanying religion. And he could only when he died and his family was trying to find a place for them, I believe it could only be exhibited in the Smithsonian American Art Museum, because it's sort of weird because it was outsider art, but it was not art for art's sake. It was different in that it was taken up by the art world because it was a challenge as to place what Hampton Thorne was doing. Sorry, James Hampton Thorne. Yeah. So it was hard to place what he was doing. He had crowns, he had goblets, he had altars, his sort of Afrofuturist mystical religion he created. So it's very hard to place within, like, it's not exactly religious museum quality stuff, meaning like it's not fit within, traditional religions. It's not necessarily outsider art because it's not labeled as the work of art. It's something entirely different. It's an integral spiritual system. So then the art world sort of like took up the mission of preserving what he made and then displaying it, because it's like literally how can you display it? So I think like a Smithsonian, a very interesting American outsider cultural expression thing is probably the correct place for it. It's not necessarily art in that he wasn't trying to achieve a status as an artist, because he didn't think of himself as an artist. He thought of himself as a founder, as a mystic, as, a very interesting story. There's a documentary on him. He called it the throne of the third heavens of the nation's Millennium General Assembly. It's, it also had some kind of like, feel-good, hippy-dippy, the UN was very popular at this time. People thought, in the 60s, 70s that it was going to like lead to global prosperity, blah, blah, blah. But anyways, moving on, Afrofuturism, I highly recommend looking into. This is the Zero World. In addition, life under the surf, sign of race, has always been equivalent to life in a zoo. In practice, two or three processes lie at the base of the constitution of a zoo. First, the abdication, capture, and caging of the animal. These animals are taken from the natural habitat by humans who have seized them. Do not, redact them, but instead assign them to vast subdivided enclosures, if required, into several mini ecosystems to get food. They're henceforth entirely dependent on those assigned to the daily upkeep. He talks about zoos. Lions do not treat like a cat. It does not share the private life of humans. It is on display. The zoo does not belong to domestic realism, to the domestic realm. The distance between humans and animals is maintained. Animal monkey only masturbate in captivity. What mean? So there's your BAP reference for the episode. The African exhibits the human zoo of the West through history was neither animal nor objects. They actually did have human zoos. You know that, right? Like that is, yeah, that's wow. This life is suspension between the animal and the world of humans, the world of objects, is still, in several respects, the law of our times, that of economy. Now it means, the economy, every economy, ultimately comes down to these two activities. Hunting and gathering, the displayed appearance, or never truly left them behind. Destruction did not take place a single blow. It occurred at the chains with multiple stations. This operation was necessary to transform the animal into meat. Was consumed either raw or as a treatment by fire that is cooked. And he talks about, various, he's making a comparative effort here. So the destruction and liquidation is incidentally its key motive movement, its condition of possibility, on par with the creation of tools. So every economy, so he's talking about the economic system. The capitalist economy in particular maintains a stock of primitiveness that forms its hidden and occasionally manifest wellspring. So it needs to put you in a human zoo. And if you were to bracket race from this, you could say the Wagey-Cagey is sort of like that zone of separation from the open, where people are slotted into use, activity, economic output. The inevitability of destruction, the ancient regime of hunting and gathering, has also been shown to operate in modern economic systems. So again, this constant theme of Mbembe of the ancient world coming back, prefiguring, coming back into modern and now hyper-modern times through the economic system that is sort of like what socialists call, socialism or brutalism. Brutalism is sort of like this return to the primitive that, like the literal Amazon wagey is sort of like, Mayan levels, Aztec levels of subjugation of enemy populations being turned into sacrifices or chattel slavery or so forth. So, and the Mayans would also breed various subclasses of peoples. And they would breed like human stock attributes that were, basically meant to till the fields, right? Like you're thinking of whole populations that way is quite devastating to our modern, quote unquote liberal sensibilities. But this is what ancient empires thought of humans as breeding stock, like any other plant that can be bred and crossbred and turned and selection pressures can be artificially coaxed into a population for certain tasks. And of course, Bronze Age pervert, he had that one part about Anthony Bourdain and Rusto Sancocho. The Western Bester on his YouTube has a clip of it, where at the end he's like, "This is all we have is the indiscriminate breeding of the human Ewok robots of previous empires." Like, oh my god, that's so devastating to really think of people in terms of human populations. But both Bronze Age pervert and Achille Mbembe both think that when you think of people in terms of populations, in terms of genetic stock, then you arrive at a clearer picture of the current system, right? But of course, BAP would say that modern dysgenics are breeding a servile, fat, ugly, dysgenic, transmogrified population that isn't capable of resistance, right? But Mbembe, this is why you must read people like Mbembe, because, if you want to talk about your, reactionary, whatever worldview, and then you look at, what the critical theorists are saying, they're saying that, actually the template of viewing whole populations and managing them through the auspices of necropolitics, using a sort of lateral instrumentalization of death itself to, basically corral populations. I mean, this has already been theorized by, even before this, by Fanon and other people, so... The inevitability of destruction of the ancient... so then moving on. The world also wears the cuts of the machine, the flesh in its veins. Crevices, chasms, tunnels, crevices, crater lakes, sometimes ochre, sometimes lateric red, sometimes copper color of the earth. The cross-sections, the open cuts, the terraces, the plays of depth, the acrid blue of the still water, the no wave skims over, as if waters were already dead. The road along the escarpment of the lunar landscape, human ants, human termites, lariat red humans that dig directly into the slope. So again, if you look at a lot of these pictures of these mines in Africa that are being propped up through various funny, sock corporations and ways that corporations, mining companies distance themselves from human populations of immense suffering. You look at the landscape, it's literally human biomass picking at the earth. And Mbembe alludes to this. A lot of these mining projects and other terraforming projects in places like Africa and Asia. It's quite something when you actually visually see it. It's like even looking at pictures of various peoples in those rivers of trash in Indonesia and elsewhere. It's it's like it's like that video edit of the Vietnam flashback music. It's like boom, 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 boom. And it's the human trash, it's the trash rivers with people picking through them. And superimposed on the screen is the famous, infamous tweet by Trash World Citizen, my good friend, episode 3 of Content Minded, Trash World Citizen. Which the quote, right? We are effing up what cannot be easily un-effed up, right? You know the quote. So, something manifestly has been extracted from the ground and crushed here in the guts of the machine with teeth, large intestine machines, Anus machines that swallows and crushes to digest the rock, leaving behind the traces in its monumental defecation. At the same time, there's a pile of iron and steel, red bricks, abandoned sheds, dismantled pieces by piece. So yeah, going on and on. Let me skip. I mean, for poetic reasons, he goes into this. But the machine has aged and become a piece of rag, a stump, a skeleton, a statue, a monument, a stela, even a phantom. Today, this world of machines that cuts, proliferates, and extracts have collapsed. It stands no longer unless under the sign of emptiness. However, in the verticality, the machine, with its rough cast stripped, continues to dominate the scenery, hanging over it with mass and steel, bearing a sort of power that is once phallic, shamanic, diabolical. Machines of power, in other words. Their architecture, their architrace in a pure facticity in order to capture this triple phallic, shamanic, diabolic power. So again, it's almost like a form of technomancy in a way to envelop the earth this way. The artist makes many shadowy figures, witnesses without witnesses, epigraph figures of an era slow to disappear. Return to the stage. In the theater of appearances, chains up humans, barefoot captives, convicts, porters, half-naked people with wild expressions emerge from the night of slaves, caravans, and forced labor in the colonies. They urge to relieve the traumatic scene of yesterday's nightmare was suddenly repeating. Being reproduced in reality of the present is to them to give voice once more. To a language of voice, a word that seems to us to have been hushed up to reduce to silence, just like the slave's voice. So again, those conditions have never left us, right? They're still present within modernity. So let me move on to the end of the book. But here he talks about the anti-museum. And I think I'll have to leave some of it for the paywalled version. But the anti-museum is a very... then it's capitalism and animism. And then I'll have to break off. Because these are very, weighty type of chapters. So here he says about the slave trade in the Caribbean, Brazil, United States. Is manifestly linked to the constitution of modern capitalism. But slave is necessary to understand a generic term that covers diverse situations and contexts that historians and anthropologists have all described. The New World, slave the New World, of whom particular was an essential cog in the planetary scale process of accumulation, is therefore a particular interest. So, the expansion in the New World, slavery soon followed. To this day, most attempts at stage the history of the transatlantic slavery in museums have stood through their vacuity. In them, the slave appears at best an appendix to another history, a citation at the bottom of the page devoted to someone else. So then he critiques the museum system here. For despite appearances, the museum has historically not always been an unconditional place of reception for the multiple faces of humanity taken in its unity. On the contrary, since the modern age, museum has been a powerful device of separation, the exhibiting of subjugated or humiliated humanities, that's quite a word. That almost sounds like a death metal lyric, humiliated humanities, has always adhered to certain elementary rules of injury and violation. As for starters, these humanities have never had the right in the museum of the same treatment, status, or dignity as the conquering humanities. They have always been subjected to other rules of classification, other logics of presentation. Added to this logic of separation, of sorting, has been that of assignation. The primary conviction is that because of different forms of humanities have produced different objects and different forms of culture, these objects and forms of culture ought to be placed and exhibited in distinct places and assigned different and unequal symbolic statuses. Of course, I don't really want to get into the museum debate about over what has more value and what can be placed where, and if it's proper, and if European national museums, in Britain especially, they're doing this war over the museum to include more multicultural things, and it's I don't want to get into that debate, but you know what I mean. You know all this. Moreover, one of the museum's functions has also been... So then he talks about, again, forms of humanities have produced different objects. So this is basically propping up differences, hierarchies, inequalities. Museum's function has also been production of statues, mummies, and fetishes. Indeed, objects deprived of their breath and return to the inertia of matter. Mummification, statuification, fetishization, all correspond perfectly to the aforementioned logic of separation. The point is generally not, it so happens, to offer the sign that has long accompanied the form some piece in the rest. It was first necessary to chase out the spirit behind the form, as occurred with the skull gathered during the wars of conquest and pacification. The slip figure, the threat that the manure figure, the slip figure might represent, or again, the potential to create a scandal, was less domesticated as prior condition of exhibition. I agree with him, actually. I think museums do deracinate various cultural objects and like basically lift them out and destroy their power from their original context. But then, of course, people like look at, for example, Islamists in the Middle East destroying statues and ancient texts and so forth. But if you could control that. I mean, well, a lot of those groups were funded and trained by the glow-in-the-darks. But, apart from that, I mean, it's true. I do agree that museums are dead places. They're halls of the dead. There might as well be funeral homes of culture. And I get the whole mission of preserving it, but from a deeper view, they truly do, like, destroy the power that these symbolic objects represented for various peoples. The slave must continue to haunt the museum such as it exists today, but does not by its absence opt to be everywhere and nowhere. Its operations always occur in the mode of breaking and entering, and never of institution. This is how the slave specter dimension will be preserved. This is also how facile consequences will be prevented from being drawn from the abomination event of the slave trade. As for the anti-museum, by no means is an institution, but rather a figure of another place, one of radical hospitality, a place of refuge. The anti-museum is also to be conceived as a place of unconditional rest and asylum for all rejects of humanity, the wretched of the earth, history that the concept of achieving struggle to contain. So I guess he's talking about a living anti-museum that is truly a place of life, and it's rather like these are all theoretical examinations of various things. Now he talks about autophagy, the archive, and so forth. Here we see ourselves depicted in a painting in which we are about to shoot ourselves in the head. Further on, we see ourselves as children in Ethiopia at the height of the famine that took millions of human lives. We are on the verge of being devoured by scavengers, that none other than ourselves. And autophagy went on to say, that is not all. In Africa, in the South of the United States, in time of racial segregation, rope around his neck. But so again, he's going on. The body of the African is a particular case in point. He means the female African, but he uses a word I can't say here. To grasp its meaning is perhaps important to recall that the black means to be placed by the force of things on the side of those that go unseen, and that one nevertheless always permits oneself to repress. Africans in particular, female Africans, go unseen because we consider there is nothing to see and that we have basically nothing to do with them. They're not one of us. Telling stories about men and women one does not see, drawing them, representing them, or photographing them have been an act of suppression authority throughout history. Supreme authority throughout history, the manifestation par excellence of the relation without desire. So yeah, the various ethnographic studies that have been done where they photograph them. I think even Leni Riefenstahl did one. So, moving on. So here he says, the image of bodies of black bodies indeed invent a chasse-croiseur of feeling, a chasse-croiseur of feelings from whoever looks at them. They invite now a game of seduction, now a fundamental ambiguity, now repulsion. So repulsion, eroticism, all of these are sort of subject to the gaze of, the European towards the racialized other. Plastic stylized bodies, they shine through their beauty and their gracious character and their lineaments. What does this black skin mean with its gleaming and slippery surface? This body placed before others' eyes, viewed from everywhere, that has placed itself in the bodies of others. What moment does it pass from the self to the status of an object? Even the beauty, I remember even way back in the day watching this documentary about the beauty industry and how they exoticize various African American and other racial groups of the models, right? So moving on, how is this object the sign of a forbidden enjoyment? Of course, the works of Kara Walker in the art world, we all know that there is sort of dark, a hidden sort of forbidden eroticism through the oppressive body, right? Like through, and those themes of the sexualization of the subjugated, especially the racialized and subjugated, have always been there. There's a long history of literature within that as well. So, in addition, and contrary to their prior traces, which they strive to inhabit and even to hijack, their images of female Africans that do not inspire any compassion. They embody first an extraordinary beauty, which, as Lacan might say, plays the extreme edges of what he calls the forbidden zone. Beauty specifically lies in the pacifying effects it exercises on the person experiencing it. In these images, pain appears secondary. Nothing in them encourages us to look away. They are far from the hideous, bloody, and repugnant images of historical lynchings. No gaping mouths, no twisted and contorted faces. Instead, they are of another beauty. In this case, they pertain to an intimate moment and movement. The body's work on itself is sometimes a matter of photographs, sometimes of spectacular images, sometimes of effigies or even reflections. But above all, it is a matter of indexical icons whose relation to the subject is once physical. So it is kind of interesting to look at when you're growing up and you see National Geographic and all those, you're a kid, you're starting puberty, and you look through National Geographic and you see those full-breasted women in the global south. It's very funny how, it's not funny, I mean, it's very interesting, like from this critical theory perspective. It is kind of messed up how that is sort of like a peevish eroticism you derive from the nakedness of these, global south populations. There's obviously something going on there. The force of the image of the black woman bodies stems from their capacity to disarm the archive. Through these images, African women accept, he keeps saying, a particular word I can't say. Not the hard R, but you know what I mean. The RO, Seeing themselves as the others, but do they really manage to extrapolate from themselves? Selves as other. They have their bodies worked on. Now all bodies, no matter which, are never entirely self-determining. A body is always also determined by the other, the one who looks at. So this is the gaze reinforcing the image of ourselves. Artie Lang talks about this. The other gives us our notion of subjectivity and so forth. Thus allowing desire to surface, including the desire for self. So self always rediscovers its own desire in the other's gaze, albeit in an inverted form. Do they see that we see themselves, or do they not ultimately stare at a mirage? In light of these considerations, we understand better the premise of the Afrofuturist critique. A present of the issue is to know if this critique can be radicalized, and if the radicalization necessarily presupposes the repudiation of every idea of humanity. In Fanon's work, no such repudiation is necessary. Humanity is forever in creation. That is at the heart of all futurism as well. Humanity is always in creation. It is meaning that, it's always a project, right? In projecting the future. Its common content is its vulnerability, beginning with the body exposed to suffering and denigration. But this vulnerability also belongs to the subject exposed to other existences and threatens its own impossibility. So again, it's always the other, and the encounter of the other will always frustrate, though, our perceptions of ourselves in the future in terms of whole populations. Allowing oneself to be affected by others or to be defenselessly exposed to another's existence constitutes the first step towards the form of recognition that will now be contained in the master-slave paradigm. In dialectic of powerlessness and omnipotence, and in the combat, victory, and defeat. So again, this goes back to Hegel. Recognizing and accepting vulnerability. So according to Fanon, the humanity in creation is the product of the encounter with the face of the other. Again, Gadamer talks about this. This person here who, in addition, reveals me to myself. It begins with Fanon calls a gesture. That is to say, that which makes a relationship possible. Humanity, as in effect, arises only when a gesture and thus relation of care is possible. When one allows oneself to be affected by the face of the other, when a gesture is related to speech or to silence and breaking language. but nothing guarantees direct access to speech. Instead of speech, what is heard may be the mere expression of raunchous cries and yelling hallucination. The unique thing about slavery or colonialism is it produces beings of pain. People whose existence is forever overrun by threatening the other. By threatening other, part of the identity of these beings involved endures the ordeal of constriction, being constantly exposed to the other's will. In part, their speech suffers from hallucinations. So let me skip to the end. Letting these injured people speak means reviving the weakened capacities. In the medical case that Fanon treated, reviving weakened capacities and transpired when and all is needed through annihilation. Taking the place of the necrosis sessions was a direct confrontation with the undercover part of the subject. That one that veiled slipped into the interstices of speech, the cry or the yell. This aggressive confrontation at the limit of violation of the personality aims to break down defenses. Humanity, so that every human has previously experienced the return to the state of absolute vulnerability, the child-mother relationship, hygiene needs, the suckling infant, one's first words, first faces, first name. So again, this is like Gadamer. It's like, just bracketing the bricklage of history to have a direct confrontation with the face of the other, one that is of clear childlike eyes, right? There's almost something Nietzschean in the sense where, like Nietzsche's, Zarathustra talks about the child being a future possibility to see with clear eyes that are not tainted by history, by the past, to go forward. So this is sort of like what Gadamer says as well. It's very different than like the liberal approach of like reconciliation or whatever. Like it's different in the sense of like starting anew is like almost an impossibility, but it's almost like what Benjamin talks about, the reconciliation of all history and its violence. So finally, he talks about capitalism and animism, but I'm going to have to breeze through it. Then he talks about emancipation of the living. Apart from this, the Afrofuturist critique of humanism can only be deepened by the combination or combining it with equivalent critique of capitalism in Capitalism and Animism. So returning back to that theme that we saw in last installment, the sort of drives that have effectively impelled capitalism since its origins. The first is the constant manufacturing of races or species, as it happens, Africans. The second is the seeking to calculate and convert everything into exchangeable commodities, law of generalized exchange relations. And third is an attempt to maintain a monopoly over the manufacturing of the living as such. And this is necropolitics. And so even like pro-immigration liberalism is really just sort of like replenishing workers' stock in our host populations, right? So that really is sort of like the Homo economicus when it comes to human bodies and the production of the living. The civilizational process will have consistent in tempering these drives and preserving with varying degrees of success a certain number of fundamental separations, in absence of which the end of humanity will become a frank possibility. A subject is not an object. Not all can be arithmetically calculated, bought, and sold. Not all is exploitable and substitutable. A certain number of preserved fantasies must necessarily undergo sublimation. The age of neoliberalism is thus in which all the barriers collapse, one after another. It is no longer certain that the human person is very distinct from the object, the animal, and the machine. He's right, exactly. We need to build a new outside of the liberal confines, but what determines that is up for debate between critical theorists like him and the far right. So, whoa. But we all hate liberalism, though. That's the thing. My politics are that I hate liberalism. That's it. That one 4chan post. Maybe the human person aspires with respect to content to become an object. And no longer certain what the manufacturing of species and subspecies within humanity is taboo. The abolishing of taboos. So again, with transhumanism, it's sort of like it won't lead to emancipation. It will lead to the further categorization of the human. It will lead to the notion that, and then so the liberals will be mask off and like, you know what? It's kind of good if we create more subspecies. Transmogrification's kind of good. That we have a proliferation of different cryptoids that are not exactly human. And it's good, and it's diversity, and we love it. And they serve various needs, and various fetishes, and various economic value. and they don't resist very much. Again, mutational load maxing is the end goal of global neoliberalism. So, and Mbembe is saying that actually the proliferation of subspecies of humans, that's not exactly going to lead to liberation. So finally, these events several others seem natural indicate some same nature indicates that the merging between capitalism and animism is well and truly advanced. Especially true as raw materials of the economy are no longer really territories, natural resources, human persons. Of course, territories, natural resources, human persons are still indispensable, but the natural setting of the economy is now the world of processes and biological and artificial organisms. So again, we've returned to animism. Dataism is a form of shamanic animism in a way. Big data is sort of like a techno-mystical gnosis. Is the astral universe of screens, fluid shifts, and meanings glimmering and radiating. It all is the world of human brains, anonymized, computerized, the computations of working with always smaller, increasingly miniaturized instruments. And the conditions producing Africans no longer consist exactly in manufacturing a social link of subjugation or of bodies of extraction or even necropolitics. That is to say, a body integrally exposed to the will of a master and from which one seeks to extract maximum profit. If yesteryear the African was the human being of African origins, marked by the sum of his looks and the color of his epidermis, today it's no longer necessarily the case. We're now witnessing a tendency to universalize the conditions previously reserved for Africans. But this condition is undergoing a reversal. This condition consists in reducing the human person to a thing, an object, a sellable, buyable, or possible commodity. He's right. He's right. That is the end goal of inframing in techno-capitalism. That you are nothing but a data mechanism, or a thing, or a cog. The depth African subaltern category of humanity, a genus of subalterns, is marked making its appearance on the world stage through more than ever capitalism is establishing itself in the modality of an animist religion. As yesteryear's flesh and bones humans yield to a new digital flux human, an animist spirit that is through the digital aether. This is incredible. This is true. Artificial prosthesis, synthesis of organs. This depth African is the other of this software humanity, this new figure of the species and typical of the new age of capitalism. The post-human is use value. The post-human is a bodiless sleeper. Is a human battery. It's not this liberation and prosthesis will deliver us to a greater depth of experience and being and we can become like gods. No, you will not become like gods. You will become like what the African was, according to Mbembe. Very powerful stuff, my God. Last, if this accelerated development of technologies for the massive exploitation of natural resources was part of the old project of mathematization of the world, blah. This project itself ultimately aimed at a single goal, namely to administer the living, biopolitics, governmentality, a process that tends nowadays to operate mostly in digital modes. In the technotronic age, the human appears more and more in form of flux of increasingly abstract codes, of increasingly fungible entities. Fungible entities, exactly. You must be fluid, you must be transactional, you are transnational, you are trans, you name it. Like, you are a fluid being, and that's not necessarily a good thing. It's not this crazy techno-utopian vision. So, the ideal henceforth that everything is manufacturable, including the living. That you are the manageable capital in an individual as a particle, a cog within a system, a dispositif. Or again, as the Foucauldian term of an era of power, particular arrangement of power is a dispositif to Foucault. Again, as a piece of information that must be translated into a code. So again, the societies of control that come out of Deleuze, right? In the universe of mega calculations, another regime of intellection is in the process of springing up, which ought probably to be characterized as an anthropomorphic machine. We're thus in the process of entering into a new human condition, Humanity is in the process of living beyond and behind the grand divisions between the human, the animal, and the machine, so typical of the discourse of modernity of humanism. Today's humanism is now firmly wedded to the animal and to the machine. It's set to artificial brains of linings and interfaces that form the basis of the extensive digitalization of its life. Masters without slaves, slaves without masters. Certainly, both humans and persons and natural resources continue to be squashed and squeezed to boost profits. This reversal of logic, after all, since new capitalism is above all spectacular and specular. Having understood this, the erstwhile masters now strive to get rid of their slaves. With no slaves, it is thought, no revolt can take place. To nip insurrectional potentialities in the bud, is deemed enough to liberate the enslaved's mimetic potential. So long as the newly emancipated slaves expand themselves in wanting to become the masters they will never be, things will never be able to be other than they are. The repetition of the same always and everywhere. Such will be the rule. So that is the real necropolitics, is the final end of digitalization. That both master and slave will erode into the abyss. That this hope that the post-human is this emancipatory and liberating thing, that post-human liberalism is the ultimate final goal, that you can basically rearrange yourself to become whatever you want, that this isn't liberation. This is basically subaltern peoples becoming all peoples. That you will be more efficient cogs, more efficient worker serfs. And if you're not that, then you're human batteries to extract information from. Because the Morlocks in the global south will still be Morlocks, and you will be a digital battery. You will be a repository. And so this grand vision, and so Mbembe is saying that, the vision of the futurists, of the post-humanists in academia, that talk about the erasure and the blurring of these lines between the human, the non-human animal, the machine, that this is great. No, it's not great. There's devastating consequences to it. That is the final necropolitics. The erasure of the human is such. We are living dead. Because these techno-informational apparatuses of capture, they're not living things. They're still of the dead world. They kind of live through their algorithms and they kind of don't. That is the final necropolitics. And to close out the chapter, the emancipation of the living, so it remains to address the racism's future within such a configuration. Historically, at least in the settler colonies of pro-slavery states, racism was always served as a subsidiary for capital. One belongs to a given class. Race made it possible to naturalize social differences. Today's new variation of racism are emerging. And this is a very interesting chapter. This is what I'll leave off the free version of. No longer needs to appeal to biology for legitimation. They're content, for example, to resort to chasing away foreigners, content to proclaim incompatibility of civilizations, to assert that we do not belong in the same humanity, to declare the cultures are incommensurable, to claim that any god that is not the god of their religion is false. I think he's dancing around this fundamental incompatibility. I think that's, but in the current condition, but see, the problem I have is that he doesn't account for the fact that, since the post-war and post-colonial era, anti-racism, anti-fascism has essentially, driven the Western world onwards. That's been, the driving, meta thought of all things. Right down to even the products that you buy. So this is where I disagree with his analysis. In the current conditions of crisis in the West, this type of racism shapes up to the supplement for nationalism. At a time, moreover, neoliberalism and globalization is emptying nationalism, so he admits this. Indeed, democracy periods of all the real conditions shifting through decisions-making centers to remote places. Globalization is basically destroying nationalism in a way. Recent progress demands for genetics and biotechnology confirms the meaninglessness of race as a concept. Agree to disagree with that one. Thus underway is a complex process of unification of the world as part of capitalism's limitless, albeit unequal, expansion. So he admits it, basically. That, woke capital is a thing. That basically multiculturalism is the handmaiden of current capitalism. or vice versa. Balkanization of the same world and division along varying lines of separation and disjunctive inclusions. These lines are at one internal to societies and states, and vertical insofar as they reveal lines of division pertaining to planetary scale domination. However, from there on, we are to pose new terms of question of the liberation of the enslaved emancipatory potential and the concrete conditions of our times. What does it mean to construct oneself, to trace one's own destiny, again to fashion oneself at times when the human is no longer anything but a force among several other entities endowed with the cognitive powers of will, perhaps soon exceed our own? I mean, that's a universal question. Synthetic, even geological forces, enough to disqualify the old concepts of an abstract and undifferentiated humanism. So again, yeah, this does complicate the sort of humanism as such. Moreover, contemporary conditions, how we are to foster the emergence of a thinking able to help consolidate a world-scale democratic politics, a thinking able to help consolidate a world-scale politics. We are indeed living through a strange period of human history. One of contemporary capitalism's paradoxes is simultaneously to create the and to annul time, to destroy time. The twofold process of creating, accelerating, and exploiting time has devastating effects on our ability to forge memory. There's a total assault of memory because, memory through digital recollection is being erased, but also time becomes limitless. Working at home, the endless, gig economy-ism, all of this is to fundamentally distort our relation to a regimented time. As a result, evoking speech and language here is important not only to think of their power of relation and their symbolic function, but above all, their materiality. In every true democratic regime, materiality of speech exists that stems from the fact that at the bottom, we all have its speech and language for given utterances to ourselves, to the world, and for acting upon this world. Now speech and language has been made tools, nano-objects, and technologies. Speech itself is a technology. As a result, the incessant flows of events that strike our consciousness hardly register in our memories as history. This is because events do not register in the memory of history except for specific labor, which is psychic as much as social, in short, symbolic. And democracy no longer takes care to ensure this labor, technological, economic, and political conditions of our civilization. So again, the current happenings never end. They just proliferate. There is no memory anymore. Memory is obliterated under the regime of signs of techno-capitalism. But then, of course, other things as well, they're cultural conditions. It's not just capitalism, but, What is ultimately finally to say about the confluence between capitalism and animism? As anthropologist Philip de Scola recalls, animism was defined as the end of the 19th century's primitive belief. Primitive peoples, as it was thought, imparted it to inanimate things a force and almost mysterious power. But that's what capitalism does nowadays, right, with technology. They believed that non-human nature and supernatural entities such as animals, plants, and objects possessed a soul and intonation similar to that of humans. These non-human existents were endowed with a spirit with which humans could enter into communication, or again, with which they could enter very close relations. This confluence shows up in the contemporary revival of a neoliberal ideology that manufactures all sorts of fictions. Thus, with the fiction of a economic human, a strategizing, cold, calculating individual. You mean like techno-capital producing autism, in other words. Internalizing the norms of the market and governing his conduct as if it's a game of experimental economics, instrumentalizing himself and others to optimize his shared enjoyment, whose emotions and emotional competences are held to genetically predetermined. So again, CRISPRing the perfect worker bee, right? This fiction leads to the liquidation of the tragic subject of psychoanalysis and political philosophy. That is, the divided subject in conflict with itself and others, nevertheless the actor of destiny by means of narrative struggle and history. So the psychoanalytical subject, like Byung-Chul Han says, and others, is overturned, and now it's the entrepreneurial subject. It's the key performance indicators. You know that short story by H.P. Lovecraft? In that you choose to, economy max your own being. Your own thoughts, your own drives are hijacked by maximum productivity. The other is also obliterated. the other becomes oneself in this system. And so therefore the other is extinguished. So Mbembe sort of half gets it and half doesn't, in my opinion. He doesn't want to approach woke capital. He doesn't want to approach anti-racism being the foundation of modern techno-capital as well. Because now you must proliferate into all corners of the earth. Sameness, the global gray goo. But you also choose it. It's not like it's this relation between master and slave. You choose your own key performance indicators of the self. You choose your own method of economaxing your own being. And so psychoanalysis and classic political economy disappear. Because now we have fundamentally different relations. This is what Byung-Chul Han says. Is that political economy disappears because now you are participating in your own mutually enforced self-referential panopticism. There's no longer governmentality of whole bodies of the population, but rather individual selves in a cell of activity, maximizing economic productivity, but also, like, you are an individual cell in a greater collective, but you choose these functions that govern your own self. So the government of populations that is held within, political ideological methods are no longer valid. It's an internalization of an ideology of efficiency maxing. And so therefore psychoanalysis is equally destroyed because psychoanalysis posits the individual self as the inner unconscious, but now the unconscious itself is made manifest on the outside through, digital techniques, through information technology. The self is enfolded outside, outwardly. We cover this with Byung-Chul Han's various texts. So both psychoanalysis and political science are obliterated. So anyways, let's take a break. Let's take a music break and let's go to the paywalled version of this. This has been very exciting so far, even though I don't exactly agree with him. I think Mbembe suffers from a lot of blind spots in terms of his own ideological persuasions. But anyways, if you need me to explain anything, just go to the comment section when it comes to the obliteration of psychoanalysis and also politics. So yeah, moving on.